Now, I was a difficult teenager and didn't believe a word of what my father told me unless there was proof, particularly when this came to the existence of God. From where I got this tendency, I've no idea, but I imagine all adolescents have it to some extent. This skepticism has stayed with me and has been reinforced over the years in many ways and is best summed up by Thomas Huxley's pithy phrase that the great tragedy of science is the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. I strongly subscribe to the view that any theory has to be backed up by facts which are solid and confirmed. I also acknowledge that our view of the world has changed over the century as facts have been discovered and will surely change in the future as ever more facts are discovered. What seems correct now is not the whole truth. In the future, people will undoubtedly have a completely different way of looking at the world, and we here will never know what that view looks like. But for right now, and indeed at any time, it would help if we could get our 21st century's facts right before jumping to conclusions. And we need to think carefully about the consequences of what we're doing, specifically in medical science, and more specifically in brain imaging, as I hope to illustrate. Now, I'm not sure whether science has become less honest over the years, more hyped up, more spun. Maybe it was always like that. But it seems to me, during my professional lifetime, that the scientific milieu has deteriorated. Frivolously, perhaps, I first blame Margaret Thatcher in the 80s for over-encouraging an aggressive go-get must-have entrepreneurial attitude, which may be okay if you're trying to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, but I don't think it is in medical science, which is the sort I know best. And then Alistair Campbell, who gave us the dreadful dishonesty of spin and sexing up documents. Now, scientists are by and large employed in industry, which has profits to make, and by universities, which are fighting to survive the financial storm. Perforce, scientists are almost always conflicted, and not as independent and as scientific as you might suppose. They have to dance to the tune of their masters, and in UK universities, which is where I come from, that means boosting their research assessment exercise grading by bringing in very large grants, and that means not teaching, dear me, no, but publishing their work in so-called high impact factor journals like Nature and Science. The impact factor itself is a marvelous example of spin, a quintessential British misnomer, just like public schools, which are anything but public institutions, or payment by results in the English, not Scottish, thankfully, NHS, which is actually payment by numbers of patients treated, irrespective of the results. The impact factor doesn't measure impact at all in the sense of changing the world, far from it. It is a citation ratio, the frequency with which an article is cited after it is published, so that an infamous article, like the MMR article in The Lancet some years ago, because it's cited so very often, increases the impact factor of The Lancet. But even irrespective of their masters, scientists are human. They want to be heard. They want to be on the Today programme. They want to be famous, or at least secure a tenured position and a pension. They think they're right about their theories and facts. They will rubbish the opposition in public and anonymously. Science is a cut and thrust business. After all, scientists should be striving to improve our understanding of the world, and by so doing are bound to tread on conservative toes. It is an anti-establishment activity. And quite right too, provided it is open, and that to me means the end, the complete end of anonymous reviewing of grants and papers, along with the expansion of responsible data sharing. And science must be honest, which means telling the truth, not cheating, not exaggerating your claims, and revealing even negative results, and in particular, any results which go against your own theories and those of the head of your department. I'm afraid there are a lot of incentives for scientists to cheat, hype, spin, sex up, and generally misbehave. But as I said, maybe it was ever like this, and we just have to be very much on our guard with all our critical faculties alert when we wake up and blearily hear about the latest scientific breakthrough on the Today programme, as I did in October last year. A relatively new virus associated with prostate cancer was the cause of that most enigmatic and mysterious condition, the chronic fatigue syndrome, so-called ME, or myalgic encephalomyelitis. This had been published in Science, about the most highly prestigious journal you could hope to be published in. But when I and my colleagues in Edinburgh actually looked at the paper, we found the very best example for teaching a first-year epidemiology course on how not to do a case-control study. The authors had compared the frequency of the signature of the virus in the blood of a highly selected group of chronic fatigue patients, the cases, with the blood from various people collected over the years and available in their deep freezes, the controls. So these controls were almost certainly not from the same background population as the cases, which they should have been, which was error number 1. Error number 2 was that the blood from the cases and controls was almost certainly not handled and analyzed at the same time, by the same people, in the same way, in the same lab. And error number 3 was that those doing the measurements may well have known who was a case and who was a control. They were not blinded. These and other sources of pretty obvious bias led to a result that was so extreme, virus in 68% of the cases, only 4% of the controls, that it was far too good to be true. Although the paper did mention the possibility that the purported association between the virus and the syndrome may not be causal, the press release from the institute where the study was done hailed the results as a major breakthrough in understanding the origins of this disease, and also then mentioned the possibility of providing patients who are positive for the virus a definitive diagnosis and hopefully very soon a range of effective treatment options. A few weeks later, another press release from the Institute announced the availability of a diagnostic test for the virus. Not surprisingly, several methodologically more robust attempts to replicate these findings have not found an excess of the virus in chronic fatigue. With their less sexy negative findings, they were published in less high citation ratio journals. But in the meantime, on the basis of this single poorly conducted and unsubstantiated study, the Canadians have banned chronic fatigue patients from donating blood in case they pass on this virus and cause prostate cancer, chronic fatigue, and other things. And worse, thousands of people with chronic fatigue have had their hopes of some light being shed on their highly disabling disorder dashed yet again. How did this elementary error happen? What does it tell us about the quality of the refereeing of the article and indeed the editors of Science? Two things. First, Science, like any other journal, needs to keep up its profile and profits. Publishing interesting, exciting, controversial, newsworthy results will do just that. And second, scientists have become so compartmentalized that the methodologies very well known to one group, epidemiologists in this case, seem to be completely unknown to another, laboratory scientists in this case, and I wonder about imaging scientists too. So is brain imaging research subject to the same problems? It must be, I think, and I can give you at least one example. Back in 2000, the media were agog that London taxi drivers, with their encyclopedic knowledge of the streets of London, had an enlarged area of brain on structural MRI scanning, the bit of brain to do with spatial memory. So maybe the cabbies' brains had been enlarged in response to their training and experience, with the implication that we could all improve the size of our brains if only we tried harder and trained harder, and maybe a bigger brain means better memory, a better job, and more money. This too was published in a highly prestigious journal, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But when you look at the paper, the level of statistical significance of the difference in the volume of the posterior part of the hippocampus in the cabbies versus the controls was only just less than this magical 0.05. In other words, this difference could have occurred 1 in 20 times by chance alone. Now that's easier to achieve than throwing a double six, because we all know we can start off various board games like Ludo, not with any great difficulty, 1 out of every 36 throws, 6 times 6. A very interesting result then in the cabbies, could be right, might be wrong, but a weak result, widely publicized and now part of our knowledge of our view of the world. So what to do? Isn't science to do with replication? Has this study been replicated? Well, I rang up Richard Morris, who's written a whole book on the hippocampus, and he told me that as far as he knew, it had not been replicated, or maybe it has been, and the results were negative, and so perhaps not submitted for publication, publication bias being another huge problem of science. In other words, studies with interesting or controversial results are more likely to see the light of day in print than negative studies, even though the former may well have been more slapdash than the latter, or even sometimes frankly dishonest. and that's why the results seem to be positive. But now we've moved from structural to functional MRI for use, as we heard yesterday, as a lie detector. Now, I'm no expert in this methodology and have not had time to read the papers, but when I Googled the topic, I came up with the Applied fMRI Institute, a private non-university setup in San Diego, which offers a lie detection service. Now, what interested me was not whether lie detection works or not, important as that, of course, is, but what risks were quoted. Not the risk of having something in your body like a pacemaker, which might move inside the MR magnet, but of finding something in your brain not previously known about and which is not causing you any symptoms or problems, a so-called incidental finding. Now, before explaining that, I should also add that I looked at the websites of one or two commercial health screening companies in the UK, such as Diagnostic Healthcare Limited in Cheshire, and not one word did I find about incidental findings, not one. Mostly, they contain nauseating, self-congratulatory compliments and overinflated, non-evidence-based claims for how imaging has led to cures of the worried well, but necessarily wealthy. Now, if any of us here had a conventional MR brain scan today, then we have about the same chance of having an incidental finding revealed as if we had one shot on a roulette wheel which has 37 pockets for the ball to land in. And this does not even include the changes in the brain white matter, which may signify damage due to deterioration of its blood supply, and which become more common with age and almost universal in the very elderly. If we had a more powerful scanner, the sort that's coming in, the chance would be even lower than 1 in 37. So, what sort of incidental things do I mean? Well, small benign tumours we didn't know we had, aneurysms, which are balloon-like expansions on the arteries which may bleed, vascular malformations, which may also bleed, benign cysts of various sorts, changes that look and maybe are like multiple sclerosis, all incidental, none producing any symptoms, possibly, probably, of no future consequence. And for everyone, we do not know their natural history because we've only been in a technological position to be aware of them before they cause any symptoms for the last few years. And no one has yet followed them up to see what happens to the perfectly healthy people with them. Indeed, maybe no one will, because this sort of research is not sexy enough to be funded, even though it's of huge public health importance. The discovery of these incidental findings may lead to the temptation for further tests to clarify the situation, and these too have their own risks and costs. For the cases we have no idea what to do about the incidental findings, even when we have a treatment, such as occluding an aneurysm before it bursts or surgically removing a tumour before it causes a fit, because although we may have an idea of the risks of the surgery, we don't know the risks of not intervening. An example of the size of the problem is that in Scotland, about 1/5 of all newly diagnosed intracranial arteriovenous malformations and about 1/2 of all newly diagnosed cavernous malformations are incidental. They may or may not one day cause trouble, and they could be removed with a not insubstantial risk, and the patient has to knowingly live with them if they're left alone, or take that risk of having something done without any certainty about the benefit. So imaging of the brain can harm you. And we're not here talking about the radiation risks of cancer associated with CT scanning. I mean the emotional damage of being told there's something in your head which might possibly one day maybe cause trouble or maybe not, for which something could be done in the way of surgery, but surgery carries a risk, and as something which might affect your life, travel or health insurance, your driving license or even your employment. In a way, it's a pity MR scanning doesn't carry an obvious physical risk like CT scanning, because that might make us think a bit harder before requesting scans without a very good reason. It's crucial, I think, that this issue is discussed with anyone having an MR brain scan for any reason which is not directly relevant to their medical condition, such as for research, lie detection, marketing, health screening, and whatever else turns up in the future. And even when an MR scan may be relevant, we doctors should think through the consequences of ordering it. Will someone with a clear-cut tension headache really be reassured to have an MR brain scan to exclude the almost complete impossibility of having a brain tumour large enough to be their cause? to then be told they do have a benign and very small tumour which has nothing to do with their headaches, what are the chances they're going to believe you? And what are the chances that they're going to insist on having the tumour taken out? And then what are the chances of them being damaged as a result? And then what are the chances that their headaches will carry on just as before? Unnecessary MR scanning can certainly damage your health. Of course, one solution to the incidental finding business is not to reveal it to the person, research subject or patient. Now, there wouldn't have been any problem with that when I was a medical student, in those far-off paternalistic days when even patients dying of cancer were not necessarily told the truth. But now we have to reveal all in the spirit of person, patient, client autonomy, and let the person, patient, client make their own choices, or put another way, dump our professional uncertainties straight into the lap of the patient, person, or client. Now, another trouble with brain imaging is not that it is now so easy and relatively inexpensive, or necessarily that it's being suggested prematurely for all sorts of things, but that people and patients are bewitched by it. Indeed, so bewitched that in the NHS, patients often come to a neurology clinic expecting a scan rather than a neurologist's considered opinion, and in commercial practice, the value of an MR scan in terms of the bill is more than twice that of an opinion, a clinical opinion, not of the scan, I mean. Somehow, the imaging hype has reached the patients, presumably via the media, who had it from the manufacturers of the machines and their supporters amongst the neuroradiologists and the neuroscientists. Indeed, who cannot be awed by the exquisite detail of a modern MR brain scan? But like any other tool, it has to be used properly, with an understanding of what it can reliably reveal and what it can't, the hard facts, and used ethically. You have to know just why you are asking for an MR scan, exactly what benefits will it bring the individual being scanned, and crucially what harms, and do the benefits either to the individual or to society in general outweigh those harms. Doctors are well used to thinking about this balance of benefits and harms when we consider treatments. So it's high time we thought about tests in exactly the same way, not just whether they may give us an answer to the patient's problem, to a research question, or what someone is thinking or feeling, or what they cost. Now, I'm going to end by giving you a real life, but albeit rather extreme example of what I'm talking about. Can you turn a light off? This presumably turns forward. Now, this is an elderly woman who became flustered and made a few inappropriate comments to one of her relatives over a few minutes at a time of considerable family stress. This was misinterpreted as a brief stroke, and she had an MR scan. And this revealed a small tumour, probably meningioma, in the right transverse sinus there. That was incidental and causing no symptoms. A cavernous malformation there, which was incidental and causing no symptoms. A microbleed there, which was incidental and causing no symptoms. And trouble in her white matter, which was incidental and causing no symptoms. So here's a lady, almost certainly with no serious disorder, who is told that she may become unsteady from the tumour, bleed from the cavernous malformation, have not another microbleed but something rather more macro, and dement from her white matter disease. So you can see, please, why I don't want you to image my brain.